intervenção de Charles Landing, que se tem destacado pela reflexão sobre a capacidade das novas empresas de renovarem as cidades e de as tornarem em espaços mais abertos, mais dinâmicos e mais felizes. É um dos mais prestigiados consultores europeus de transformação cultural, criativa e urbana, tendo completado vários projetos em diversas cidades para clientes públicos e privados. Em simultâneo, faz também conferências e palestras por todo o mundo. Vamos então ficar com Charles Landing.
Right, hello. What a fantastic place, what a fantastic atmosphere in this building. I think perhaps we all should do this for a moment, actually. Sorry, I mean, I just feel we've been sitting a bit and I need to stretch, and this is the ideal place to do it. Anyway, show me my first picture, please. Right, one of the interesting things that I noticed yesterday was, of course, the tower. And looking closer at the tower, I suddenly realized something in the background, and I saw, obviously, an element of the rebirth that we can see everywhere here. And I want to discuss 3 or 4 things today. The first is to give you an overview of what I think is happening in the context of urban change. Secondly, to make some comments on your own programs here. And thirdly, to suggest a way of assessing the creativity of a city like Saint-Gilles and the other cities in the region. Now, if you look at cities and you think of what are the essential points that really make a great place, and I think there are 5 points. The first is great places have some anchorage somewhere, they have an anchor, but at the same time they've got possibilities. They connect with the world, they're places of learning and so on. And these, I think, are timeless principles. And it's already been mentioned today, the question of memory, that if you forget your memory, you really do not have a future. And that is an incredibly important starting point. Now, obviously, I know about some of the things you've told me about your memory. I saw this picture with all these hats. I thought it was very interesting. And the fact that they're all men who are wearing the hats and no women. But, of course, memory inspires, as we know, and all over the world there are places, this is in Holland, where these types of places have been reconverted into the new economy. They look old, but in fact they're very new. And this reminds me of a great saying by one of the urbanists, Jane Jacobs, who said, "New ideas need old buildings." And I think that's true when you look around the world. The other point is this question of possibility. Possibility and rethinking. Rethinking everything, rethinking shoes, which I know you're trying to do. Looking at shoes as an example in a different way. That's just one element. Every aspect of what we do can, in one way or another, be rethought. The third is this question of connections. It is impossible now to be a small city in a city region, like here, Porto and so on, without connecting both culturally to other regions. We just heard about the connection between here and Galicia and so on. So that is equally important, internally, regionally, and with the world at large. And then fourthly, what makes great places is that they're places of learning at the same time. And I know that you're trying to do that learning here as well, in terms of, for example, the dance school on the other side of this building. And in a sense, over time, you may have some university-type facilities here as well. And finally, one needs some element of inspiration. I'm not suggesting the cafe here looks like this, but all of these things need to fit together into some sort of picture. Now, the central issue, as we all know, is the dramatic transformations around the world, which we've already discussed. You've experienced them directly, so we don't need to elaborate in any way. But one of the effects of all of this is, of course, that the internet and other new technologies have enabled the world to become smaller in many places. Cultures are merging together in some ways. This is a great opportunity, and at the same time, it can be quite disturbing. But nevertheless, the world is a smaller place. At the same time, places, cities, small and large, are competing at a completely different level. And every city is trying to be magnetic in some sort of way. So the challenge for a place like Suzhou is to see to what extent, even though it is small, it can be connecting to the wider world directly, rather than, for example, going via Lisbon or any other sort of area. So my map of the new centrality of this region somehow puts you in the middle, but you're still connecting with the globe in every sense. But this connection, as we heard earlier this morning with the three mayors, and let's assume Porto is the big thing in the middle, will only work when these little dots, these little points, are brought together, and that the connection can be made that 1 + 1 equals 3 in one way or another. We know collaborative competition is the way forward, especially in regions which are competing with places like China and so on. The other point about that is, as we already know, we may be using new languages, your mayor was saying today, and we need to use new language. But in fact, we're talking about old things. For example, clustering. Clustering, of course, is important. It's just a different form of clustering. But you had clustering when we just heard a minute ago that there were 1,200 furniture factories in Paris. Now, one thing we need to consider, though, is a different sort of conceptual model. The old model, the old Oliva model, which was fantastic in its way, had one company, one idea, one form of producing this massive factory here, one way of distributing to the outside world, to consumers and people everywhere. That's fine, but we're living in a different world, and this is perhaps a better way of graphically thinking about the world that is emerging, which Oliva is trying to deal with. It's lots of small entities coming together in different ways, finding ways of producing together, distributing in very varied and diverse forms, and coming to households. This is a very different model, but it's the same place we're doing it in, and that requires a completely different form of organisation. And one of the key aspects of this is, of course, the need to foster entrepreneurship between smaller entities that together, of course, can form a bigger entity. Within this, of course, are some things that are a bit, for many people, unclear. The whole idea that there's a pop-up culture, that a product arises just for a month, that a shop is only there for 3 weeks. Things seem to be changing all the time, and that makes many people feel insecure. But this is the world we operate in, and this requires places where one can meet, talk, interact, because that is, of course, always, and has been always, the essence of what makes great cities. But another element within that, of course, is the sharing dimension, which is why this question of networking and collaboration is so important. And this physical space here, this side here with that side over there, with the road in between, is for me actually one of the ideal places to do that. But this logic I'm discussing, of course, reshapes the identity of a place like Suzhou. On the one hand, it is itself, but on the other hand, it is also something bigger with the other partners, the metropolitan partners we've heard about. And this is not simply a choice that we may do it, it's absolutely essential. The potential of this region will only happen, as you well know, through that collaborative effort. Now, the other aspect of this trend, of course, is this phenomenon of us being here and there simultaneously. We're here in this northern region of Portugal, but we're also, through mobile phones and all sorts of other devices, connecting and networking elsewhere. And this need to network and collaborate has reached such a completely different level than the form of networking that we had before. And again, that means really changing the mind for many people. Of course, you know all of that, you experience it every day. But if we think about that and just stand back, it changes the way we look at the world. And you could call it, like this shop here in Edinburgh, a paradigm shift. But what it does do for each city and each place, it puts them at a crossroads, because the way we have organised ourselves, the way we manage ourselves, is often still based on the industrial model that has already disappeared. But just to remind you, you know, of course, the changes in the economy as it emerged and evolved over the last 80 years or 50 years to a more knowledge-intensive economy. But increasingly people have realised, in order to get an innovation or have knowledge, we first need creativity, we first need imagination, we first need curiosity. Now the problem for every city around the world is that everybody is realising this at the same time. And the question really is, what about you? What is different about you that will make you distinctive in contrast to the Basque Country, in contrast to northern France, and so on? And what this is really about is that it's very unpredictable, because in the past, the way we planned was very much in a predict and provide model, whereas now what we're trying to do is create the conditions so we can plan for the unknown, plan in such a way that we become resilient even though we don't exactly know what will happen. We have a general strategy, but we don't know, like in the past, in the simple way of planning, exactly where we are going. And this is what makes this whole environment we're in both fragile and at the same time quite exciting and obviously quite liberating for some people, but for others it feels threatening. Now, coming back to where we are now, what do we do? I think this perspective, the way the world is changing, means that we have to look at all sorts of things in a different way. The intellectual architecture we use in our mind, the way we think of planning, the way we think of what schools are teaching, like we heard earlier from the mayor's meeting and so on. So let's look at this a bit more closely. We know that there was in the past just simply producing from raw materials, that's fine. We know that the next stage was all about mass producing things in a reasonably reliable way that worked, that made things solid and so on. We know we also evolved into a next stage where the quality paradigm was the key paradigm. We know that happened. We know then that the next paradigm, in a sense, was about design, the value added of design, which has been discussed already. And of course, the Apple iPhone is the emblematic sort of instrument that describes that. So we know that design adds value in one way or another, does strange things sometimes. But look at this. This is Toronto's stock exchange. I was very interested to note the other day that this stock exchange closed and it was transferred into a design exchange, because where is capital coming from? Is capital coming simply from financial markets? Is that the most important capital? Or is it the capacity to turn ideas into reality, which design is about, that is most important? The other point, as this image here shows from the States, Minneapolis, is the use of creativity at work. But that creativity needs a value base as well. And what I find interesting about the mission of this region is the combination of wanting to inspire creativity, but at the same time to work in a solidary way, to have solidarity. And these things seem to be not on the same page, but they are. Because unless the creativity is inclusive and is anchored in some set of values, it's not really very interesting. So the next phase, of course, in this process of evolution is the fact that now we're moving from tangible to intangible things, where it's about ideas making money and then you use the resources to do that, rather than starting with the resource as we did in the past. And this has led practically every city to reconsider their future. From the Shanghai Expo, the Pavilion of the Future. And what was noticeable about that, and its theme was Better Cities, Better Life, was really that every city globally was reassessing how it brings in the past into its future, how it's able to blend in nature and the physical city. And this, of course, is an advantage for this region. You've got your cities, but you've got a lot of nature very near around you. And how to dream again and recreate, in a sense, a city that has some aspects of utopia in it. So the question is, and you can even see here, this is in Australia, someone saying, do you believe in reincarnation? Clearly here you do believe in it. But the whole creative city agenda, for example, is a positive agenda because it believes the glass is half full rather than half empty. Now the problem about this reincarnation, this thinking cities, is this is really a cultural project. It's cultural in the sense that we have to change the way we think and our minds and so on. And that often is very difficult. And I think for each of us it involves a slight shift in perception in order to make the most of the potential. Now one issue that is really key is that for the most of the last 200 years, and certainly there was a study done in US cities, people chose in the past the company before the job. Now, increasingly, people have choices, and they choose the place first, and then the job within that. Now that means there's a completely different level of competition going on, which is really about the level of vibrancy, the level of attractiveness, and the quality of life in cities. Because if you want to keep your talent and want to attract talent, it's really the quality of the place that is absolutely most important. And then, what are the companies within that? So companies increasingly are following people rather than people companies. And places are the things that attract people. So that means that the way we see the city should be different. It's much more about what is the overall sensory feeling of a place that means that it becomes a pole of attraction. And so far, we've always used hardware as the driving thing of urban development. This urban engineering approach to city making, as we know, as we heard from some of the examples, has created places that are okay, but actually from a sensory perspective are pretty either ugly, purely functional, and so on. And so there's a shift in thinking from hardware to software thinking about how cities should work. Now that does not mean that I do not respect engineers. I think engineers are fantastic and so on, but it's more, a city is more than hardware. Which is why we need to have a different approach, perhaps a plan B. And this is why lots of places around the world, this is Taipei in Taiwan, are creating things that look a bit bizarre. This is in a very underprivileged area in Taiwan, which is called an urban acupuncture point, this one, after Jaime Lerner's Curitiba idea of urban acupuncture, where throughout the city they're inserting things that look very strange, that are very much related to the design of audiovisual industries we've been discussing, and are inserting these in places as poles of attraction. And I think this, of course, here at Oliva is a major pole of attraction too. Within this particular example, there is, of course, incubators for young people to start up their business. Now, all of what I've been talking about means that we need to rethink planning in a different way. So I hope all of these other things will be part of the future development of Oliva too in the future. It means that the planning we're talking about needs to both be inspirational, but at the same time draw people from the community into it at the same time, which will involve obviously quite interesting and often difficult discussion. Secondly, it means rethinking what an urban resource is. We have to remember that the idea of refurbishing buildings like Oliva, like this, is only really 30 years old. 30 years ago, of course, we used to tear down most of these buildings. So to see that the past is a resource for the future, in fact, is a relatively new idea, because people realize it brings life, it brings oxygen, if you like, to a place. And it also seems to be, again, as I said earlier, the sort of setting that creates new prospects and generates originality and generates new concepts and so on. And these are just places in London which are doing exactly what you are trying to do here. The third thing I think is important is because so much of what is important is invisible, everybody needs to find ways of making these invisible things that are happening visible. And that means more than just marketing promotion. It means trying to find ways of emblematically and symbolically showing that this is a central point. And this might, in this case, be, in the Oliva case, be through all sorts of bizarre events you do, and celebrations, and so on. And I know one way of doing it, of course, is here through industrial tourism, as one example. It also means that these changes I'm talking about is rethinking how one designs cities and creates space. For example, the typical thing might be to say, let's knock all of those old factories and put my buildings there. My view is if you keep those and do interesting things with them, other interesting things will happen outside here, which will create the value, the capital value that you need. And so this, therefore, acts as the catalyst. And I think one of the most important things about this particular thing is it works like a street in the middle here. Because it's like a street, it's like a neighbourhood. Because it's like a neighbourhood, it becomes a district. But what this also means is, as we've discussed earlier, that we need to rethink the way things are governed. Of course, it isn't only the public sector, it's the civic sector, the public sector, and the private sector working together. It's about a bureaucracy that perhaps itself is created. And that means also that we need to tell this story in a different way. And we heard a number of stories in the meetings of the mayors earlier, and that is precisely what could burst through for this region. And I know that you need to use Porto, because the brand is Porto, of this bigger story that can be told of this region. And within that, of course, we know, these are some bricks which are lying over there, that needs to build on the old culture, because I've noticed that in cities in transformation, when you go with the grain and the flow of existing culture, those cities and those places are much more willing to change than if one goes against the culture. Now, in terms of this moving to the creative economy more specifically, some people think the creative economy and the creative cities are basically about art. Yes, art is important. Yes, we want to fill this place with artistic people. Of course, that's very interesting. Some other people say, well, the creative city is really about the creative economy, these sectors that we've been discussing today. Yes, I think that's true. I think these sectors are incredible drivers of the new economy, but I don't think it's the totality of a creative city. Others say you need a creative class, these groups of people, these designers and artists, but also software engineers and so on, which may represent 25% of the population here. Yes, I think that's true too, but I don't think it's the totality of what is required. Clearly you need the technological people as well, like you have here already, but I think what is required to make these places really work is to create the conditions where the other 75% of ordinary citizens as well have a role in becoming part of the makers and shapers and co-creators of the new place that you're trying to generate. As it says here, ordinary people can make the extraordinary happen if given a chance. So this creative place, which I think could be called a city, provides or needs to provide the conditions where we can think, plan and act with imagination. And therefore, what we're really talking about is a creative ecology, where all of these conditions are there, where being creative is part of the DNA, not only for the sector called the creative economy, but for the community at large. Now, why are people focusing specifically on the creative economy? Or is this just a fashionable thing? Now, my answer to that is no. Because just in the same way that IT is an essential part of how our world works, it's like electricity. I think the creative economy is really the nervous system, the electricity, if you like, of the way economies as a whole work. Not only are they sectors in their own right, but they are the things that add value to all kinds of other industrial sectors too. For example, if you look at biomedicine, you will find there's a lot of creative economy activities in biomedicine. If you look at e-commerce, the same sectors are involved there. If you look at logistics, the same sectors are involved there. And I've done a lot of work around tracking the activities of design and music and sound and visualization in other industries. And you can see that these other industries could not work without the contribution of the creative economy sectors. From your perspective, the most important thing I feel is that there is here combined production and consumption. That it's not only a place where we display things, but there's real things being made. And I know you are emphasizing this. And this is also about this balance. It's easy to create the container here, the building, but it's more difficult to fill it with this content, which I know you're thinking about. But that is one of the issues to consider. So it is about finding different ways and different types of office structures. This is a co-working space in Lille in France, a German invention where you can move your office around on wheels. These are it's just an example. It's about creating environments where interesting ideas can develop and so on. And I think the result will be like here, this is a little container city in Singapore where all these types of new organizations suddenly emerged from being in the right setting and the right environment. The other thing I think might be quite important, because how are you going to surprise the world? This is a bit outside of Porto. The mental geography is far away. I think this region being seen also as an experimentation zone, as a place where things happen which you would never expect, could be quite interesting. I'm not suggesting a Zeppelin goes between these two buildings, but you get the point that I'm making. That surprise is very important so that you get that resonance beyond purely the region, the north, into other countries as well. And I'll explain why I think that's important in a second. Now, I don't expect you to read this, but I just want to remind you that creativity is more than the creative economy. It's about all sorts of processes. It's about hospitals being creative. It's about social services being creative. It's about lots of other sectors too. And I think we should have that in the back of our mind. Now let's look at this. Can this very big project in this small place work at the level it is? My view is that this is so big. This is the first division. This is in football terms in the first league, this project. And that has, I think, dramatic implications. It means that this place has to operate, that's my feeling at least, at an international level, which comes back to this point that this place, the people involved here, all the other places I heard described, art blocks, etc., need to work in the international market. In the same way as the chair competition in its own way was internationally oriented. I don't think if you put a project like this into the European setting, you can, it's so big and powerful, it cannot operate only at a regional level. It has much more importance. Now what is the advantage though in general, the disadvantage of smaller cities? I think smaller cities, we normally think, have a disadvantage. That's true, but I do think they also have advantages. If these smaller places, and this is the big advantage, I think between you are small enough to make it happen, but big enough to be taken seriously. Normally small places are inward-looking and slightly closed-minded, but from what I've experienced, these smaller places around here, which we heard about earlier, are open-minded, which means it's easier for you to do things than in bigger cities. Bigger cities have the danger of becoming so complex, so politicized, that it's very difficult to do anything of substance. So that, I think, is the key advantage of the smaller place. Small enough to make it happen, big enough to be taken seriously. Now there are various ways we can look at this, and this will be on the website or somewhere so you don't need to think about what I'm writing there. But if you think about leadership, if you think about thinking ahead and so on, smaller places are just as good as bigger places in thinking ahead. Where they have difficulty is being the centre of the universe, being the hub that everybody knows about in the world. And that's why, collectively, you need to do things, and that's why I'm talking about things like surprise. You have to surprise the world so that people say, I never thought that could happen in the city region around Porto, in São João, etc., etc. So that's what I basically think about the Oliva factory. I think it's a major opportunity. I think it's much bigger than perhaps you even thought about. This is at the European level, and you have to meet that challenge of that European potential. Now finally, I just want to suggest something, how you might measure your pulse, your creative pulse, as cities as a whole. Because I don't think a city is creative if it only has one aspect that is creative. And I'm going to just mention 10 points here. Now in measuring this, you can either be 10, which is fantastic, or 1, which is very bad. You think about how well you are doing as I go through this. The first area one needs to look at, what is the political framework like? The public framework? What is the incentives regime like? The regulations? How creative is the civic sphere? Okay, we've heard lots of things already. It seems that this area, São João, is doing pretty well on this. This is about rules and regulations. Is it simple or complex? Have you rethought the rules in terms of the new conditions that exist today? Have you refitted and remodeled things so they fit your strategy and your vision? Secondly, one thing you need to assess is what is the level of distinctiveness, vitality and expression capacity in this place? Is it being allowed to come out? This is all about the authenticity, the experience of the place and things like that. Another way of putting it, it's about the soul of this place. How is that being expressed? And I think, obviously, this place expresses it very well. In lots of ways, there's the Hat Museum. There's lots of things that are part of that project. And even that clown, it says about the clown over there, is one element of this expression. The third thing is how open is this place? How open are all these cities part of this metropolitan region? Are they accessible, both physically, mentally, but also in terms of the way they think? Is this an open place? Or is it a place that is more closed? Now obviously, we don't want to be completely open, but are you more open than you are closed? Very important, are you open to different cultures, different backgrounds, and so on? That's what really makes places feel metropolitan. The next measure is how entrepreneurial is this place? Not only in terms of the private sector, but also in terms of the social sector. Is there a lot of social entrepreneurship? Is being entrepreneurial validated and accepted and supported in all sorts of ways? That's all about, trying new ideas out, imagining things, getting resources to be able to fund a new idea, new venture capital systems, and so on. The fifth domain we need to look at is how strategically agile is this place. We've heard all the mayors talk about their strategies, and I think that's fantastic. But we know, of course, that actually sometimes to get towards the goal we want, you have to be strategically principled and clear, but tactically very flexible in getting there. So that's a very important dimension to becoming a better, more place that is about the future. And that's really about all the different parties in a city coming together, bringing something to the bigger whole that is the city. For example, the biggest question that requires creativity today is the fact that American cities operate as if they needed 5 worlds. European cities operate as if there were 3 worlds, and there's only 1 world. So it would be interesting to see some creativity applied to that, using sectors like design, audiovisual, and so on, to help through invent new products and services. For example, Freiburg in Germany, the green city of Germany, has gone down that route, and of course has attracted massive institutes like this Solar Institute, where 930 people are working, inventing new things in that environmental sphere. So this is about leadership. There are ordinary leaders who dig holes. There are leaders who can tell a story about a place, who really are the ones we're looking at. And leaders, when I say leaders in a city, it's not only one person, the mayor, it's the city as a whole. Perhaps in Sarjal, 500 or 1,000. Then, the 6th area, and this may be a bit of a weakness for this city here, Sarjal, because it's small, it doesn't have a university. How good is the system of learning? Can you attract others to connect with you? Perhaps universities in Porto, to have a little branch here, or something like that. Then there's the question of how well does this place communicate internally and to the external world? This is about physical mobility, virtual mobility, and so on. How well do the sectors connect? Economics and culture, for example. Do people connect across boundaries and barriers? This is about all forms of connection and communication. I found it quite interesting coming on the motorway here, that you've got very good motorways, but there are not many cars on them, but that's a separate issue. But anyway, perhaps that's the historic Eurozone debt problem. But this is the issue. This probably cost 100 million euros. If you'd spent 10 million euros on soft infrastructure, what do you think would have had more effect? Okay, just a question. Anyway, it's about getting out of the box in one way or another. Then, just a few more things. What is the place like? And how are you making the place? Is the place that's being made and now created at this moment one that inspires? Paredes said that its place was a bit ugly. okay, so perhaps the place is not very good. But what the mayor was talking about was interesting because he was trying to lift the place into a different level, that it had distinctive identities, it had distinctive shops, and so on. So this is obviously Bilbao, as we know, but I think we all agree that some of that was a very good intervention in transforming the way the city looks and feels. But you can see already in terms of placemaking, there's a new aesthetic. This is Paris. That people are trying to show through the physical environment that they're trying to be green in both, in a deeper sense, as well as just being green in terms of grass. So how is this place going to develop is the question here in the long term. Then, more or less towards the end, how livable is this place? What are the facilities like? We've got facilities like this, but is there an equally good balance in terms of hospital facilities, recreation, and so on? Is it going to remain affordable here as this gentrifies and becomes more special and well known? Is it going to be a place, you might need bicycles with little motors here in this town, but nevertheless it's that sort of thing I'm talking about. How easy is it to get about? And finally, how professional is this place? How can we rely on it? How effective does this place, what is the measure in 1 to 10? Can I rely on the promises that the city makes about itself? And when we do this analysis of cities, we look at it from the internal perspective of the city, the citizens and the decision makers, but also from an external perspective. So, is this a professional place? Can we trust this place? And when I saw this, I wasn't quite sure whether this was unprofessional or creative. When I first saw it, I thought the person who was drawing the lines was too lazy to move the tree. And then I thought, hey, this is the most creative person I've ever met. Because he realises the world is not like that, it's more like this. This is how we get to A to B, in that sort of way. So what this is all about is really switching the question. For 30 years I've tried to answer this question. People have asked me, what is the value of creativity? What's the value of art, design, the value of green infrastructure, the value of soft infrastructure? That always is people saying, who are you? Prove what you are. I never answer that question anymore, never. I ask that person who asked me this question, what is the value? I ask them this question. What is the cost of not being imaginative? What is the cost of not going with the flow of culture? What is the cost of not thinking about new ways of thinking? And that to me is perhaps the most important thing. So ultimately, lots of these things are about money, but it's not all about money. It's really about, even when we don't like each other, coming together in some sort of way. And the reason is, as you know, it's really about the next generation. And that next generation is partly in the back there, I can see some of them. And that's all I've got to say. Thank you very much.
Depois desta brilhante e esclarecedora intervenção de Charles Landry, a sessão está encerrada. Só gostaria de dar uma pequena nota. Já se encontra online no site olivacreativefactory.com, onde podem obter mais informações acerca deste projeto. Seguidamente vamos também fazer uma breve visita às instalações e como a obra está a decorrer, há percursos delineados que eu pedia que cumprissem para garantirmos as questões de segurança. Obrigado pela vossa presença.